Good morning. My name is Jay Rubenstein. I'm director of the Center for the Pre-Modern World here at USC Dornsife, and it's my privilege to welcome you to day 2 of our symposium, Conspiracies Then and Now. When we look at conspiracies and conspiracy theories as they happened in the distant past, as they're happening today, and we try to draw lessons out of that exercise. Yesterday, we had a great time talking about conspiracies in general, about theories of conspiracy. We talked about how anti-Semitism has played a long and troubling role in the history of conspiracies. And we concluded with ideas and language of conspiracies travel. Today, we're going to do some deep dives into more fun and well-known conspiracies, including the Templars, the Deep State, and maybe the biggest conspiracy of them all, the end of the world. So thanks for joining us. Thanks to my colleagues at the Center for the Political Future and at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, who really made this fabulous event possible. And with that, I would like to pass the mic over to Bob Shrum, my colleague at the Center for the Political Future, who will oversee and moderate our first panel. Bob.
Hi, good morning, everyone. For most of the next hour, we're going to focus on the Templars, but we're also going to apply the lessons of the Templars to a lot of what we're experiencing today. They were one of the West's most trusted institutions, and then suddenly they were condemned, accused of sodomy, witchcraft, Satan worship, among other sins. We'll explore how similar trends target America's civic institutions, from McCarthyism to the Kennedy assassination to 9/11 to today. Our panel, and we're very grateful to have them here. Sean Field is professor of history at the University of Vermont, where he tells me it's 30 degrees. Karen Pekoski is an award-winning filmmaker, Pulling the Thread, the associate professor of cinema and television arts at Columbia College Chicago. Julien Théry is professor of history at the Université Lyon 2, Louis Lumière in Lyon, France. And Michael Shermer is an author and a presidential fellow at Chapman University. I'm going to start off with a general question, and I think, Kristen, I'll just throw it to you. Why have conspiracy theories seemingly been so alluring since the beginning of time?
I think there are a lot of reasons. One of them is that they satisfy a lot of emotional needs for people, particularly when they're faced with loss or a sense of disempowerment or a really frightening situation. Human beings are really wired to gravitate towards stories that explain those kinds of powerful feelings. And conspiracies do that job really well. They externalize the problem and convince us that it's not our fault that this happened, it's somebody else's fault. The system was rigged, the other team cheated, etc. They also do a great job of unifying our team against the other side, right? So we see that in the world of politics. If we believe that the other side is conspiring against us, it's much easier to sort of rally the troops and get them to work together to try and win the next election or the next sporting event or what have you. And paradoxically, conspiracy theories tend to make people feel a little bit more in control of the situation. That might seem counterintuitive, but part of the narrative is that if we just understand what's really happening beneath the surface and expose it, then we can neutralize the threat and everything will be right with the world.
I want to make this a free-flowing discussion. And by the way, I forgot to announce that at 10:45, we'll go to audience questions. So if you put them in the chat, I'll be able to ask them at about 10 to 15 minutes before we conclude. Anyone want to comment on that, or can I go on straight to the Templars? I'm going on straight to the Templars. They were, as I said.
I'll jump in.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, well, okay. Yeah, I agree with Kristen. I think that's exactly right. Let me read to you just a couple sentences from well, I'll just read the sentences. Have you ever wondered why we go to war, or why you never seem to be able to get out of debt? Why there is poverty, division, and crime? What if I told you that there was a reason for it all? What if I told you it was done on purpose. This is from a QAnon videographer talking about what he thinks is really going on. And, in response to that, people think, yes, okay, so, complicated issues like war and poverty and human conflict, which social scientists study with, massive regression equations and multiple variables at work. And it just kind of, it's not romantic, it's not sexy, it's hard work. And so it's just easier to think, what if it's just this one thing that causes it all? So there's kind of a reduction of explanatory power into just one factor, and that's appealing. It's like, the idea that there's, a Jewish cabal or the alien lizards or whatever that are running the world. Scarier than that is that no one's running the world. There is no committee in charge. No one's in charge, and that's discomforting to a lot of people. And that's one aspect. Conspiracy theories are probably overdetermined from a social scientist perspective, but certainly more than one explanatory factor to explain the conspiracy theories themselves. Not the least of which is there's just enough true conspiracy theories. That is to say, conspiracy theories that turn out to be true. Think Watergate or Iran-Contra, or all the shenanigans that the WikiLeaks exposed that the United States government was doing. Those are conspiracies. So in a way, it's not unreasonable for people to think, yes, there might be something to that, whatever that is.
Okay, let me go back 800 years to the Templars, who were, as I said earlier, a pillar of medieval society. Who were they? What happened to them? Why and how was it conceivable? Did King Philip of France have an overweening desire to seize their wealth? And did that drive the conspiracy theory, or were there other factors? And any one of you can start with this.
Maybe I could start, and then I'll hand it over to Julianne. So who were the Templars? The Templars were one of the new military orders of the early 12th century. That means they were churchmen, they were monks, and like any other monks, they were vowed to poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they were also warriors. They were dedicated to the defense of the Holy Land. And across their 2-century history, they were a fairly successful, fairly powerful, fairly wealthy order with houses all across Europe until the fall of 1307, when the King of France, Philip the Fair, and the men around him wrote up secret arrest orders and had all the Templars in the Kingdom of France arrested with really impressive efficiency on the 13th of October, 1307. And the Templars were rounded up, they were threatened, they were tortured, and most of them confessed within just a couple of weeks. And what they confessed to was a list of charges that centered on the idea that when someone joined the Order of the Temple, they underwent a secret initiation ritual that involved spitting on the cross, renouncing Christ, worshiping idols, indecent kisses, and agreeing to be available for homosexual acts when asked to do so. And the Pope at the time, Clement V, was unhappy about these events because he had not been consulted, because the church was not involved in these arrests and these accusations. And so a month or so later, he had all the Templars all across Europe taken into custody in an attempt to get control of the situation. And there's a whole 5-year process with many twists and turns, but in the end, in 1312, the Pope, the church, simply dissolves the order without ever clearly making a statement about its guilt or its innocence, simply saying the order is too besmirched, its reputation is too harmed. And so Templars are simply brought to an end without any real clear resolution. And so there was a conspiracy. The real conspiracy was at the level of the King of France and his men launching these false charges. But the charges themselves were that the Templars constituted a conspiracy against the Christian world, against the good Christians of France, and against God's representative in France, the king himself, Philip IV. Maybe Julianne could speak more clearly than I think maybe to some of the motivations involved.
Well, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Fine. Yes, this has always been the big question. I mean, why? Why did the Templars, why were the Templars accused this way of such horrible crimes? And the question's always been always been said. I mean, actually, no satisfactory answer was ever given, and this is why it has always been said. Well, probably the wealth, probably the money. That must be one rational, clear reason, and the only one can think of is money, the wealth, and this actually at the very time of the trial was said by some people, and the counselors of the King of France felt the need to say, we're not interested in the money. We have texts, we have a speech of one of the king's first closest counselors before the Pope in 1308, saying, this is not about money. And actually, this is, I mean, it's rather easy to think about this factor, this explanation. And actually, we think about this explanation because we have no other. I mean, there's been no other for a very, very long time. And the one most many historians think about now, which is much more plausible, actually, even though albeit maybe a bit more difficult to see and understand, is religious. That is, what was at stake with these accusations from the king was who, between the king and the Pope, will be now the real vicar of Christ on earth. First in the kingdom of France, and then in the Latin world, but also on earth, simply because I mean the vocation of the vicar of Christ is to lead Christianity, is to lead the Christians also on the Promised Land, in the Middle East, and it is to convert everyone. That was, in a way, of course, the mission of the Templar Order: defend the faith in Jerusalem, and the very headquarters of the temple, as you know, were located in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, right? The Templars were the papacy's closest order, one could say. Both bodyguards, both closest bodyguards of the popes, the guys that stood with him every day in his room, the chamberlains, were Templars. And so if the King of France suddenly discovered that there was a plot, a Templar plot of the whole order, being this order actually a satanic sect, a plot to overthrow Christianity, that was in an indirect way indicting the papacy, right? Saying, well, see, you Pope, you say you want us to think that you're the vicar of Christ on earth, but you're not able even to find out that your closest religious order is a sect, is a heretical sect. This is what the discovery of the discovery of the crimes of the Templars, that is the royal conspiracy, was all about. Actually, this is one way of seeing it that's getting more and more attention among historians.
Were the Templars guilty of something, and why wasn't the target one of the other wealthy orders that resembled them?
Julien, could I answer the first half of that and pass the second
Of
to you
course,
there?
of course,
So,
of course.
almost all historians today agree that the Templars were not guilty of anything. And where we have the proper documentation to do real studies of this, it's abundantly clear that the process was very simple. The king's agents had their written orders that included a list of accusations. They were told to threaten, to promise, to torture where necessary, and they did that very effectively. And so when the Templars confessed, these are not freely spoken confessions. They're simply repetitions of the accusations themselves. The accusations become a mirror image of the confessions. And so it's abundantly clear that there simply is no evidence in those confessions to tell you anything about whatever happened in the real world. The confessions just reflect the logic that the power of the state imposed on these people through torture. But it does mean that confessions were recorded, and they were done very properly and legally as notarized documents by people who know how to create documents that would be admissible in legal courts. And they look very impressive. They looked impressive at the time. and they look impressive 700 years later. When historians read them, they look like very clear legal documents, and we're trained to read documents very closely. And so you can read through hundreds and hundreds of confessions, and after a certain time, it becomes very easy to feel like where there's smoke, there must be some fire. But in fact, that logic is deeply flawed and methodologically untenable. No matter how many of these confessions you read, you will not be getting any closer to the truth. You're just reading what the power of the French state wanted you to read all these many years later. Julien, I think maybe the second half of the question is better aimed at you.
Well, yes, and one could add that it must be observed that there was hardly any confession where torture wasn't used. For instance, it is very often underlined that the English Templars who weren't tortured didn't make any confession. Most confessions actually come from the Kingdom of France, and we have very, very few confessions from anywhere else than France, except from areas, for instance, in Italy, where torture was used. And also, if you have to believe what's in those confessions, then why would you believe that those people had a kiss on the anus of the religious master that had them into the order as a sign of a satanic pact, right? As they were accused? Why would you believe this, but not believe that suddenly a black cat appeared and made all kind of tricks or that kind of stuff? Well, so you can hardly decide. You have to say, well, it's true or it's not true. But it's not a good method to choose what pleases your mind in those confessions. So yeah. Can you remind me about the second question? The second question exactly. Sorry.
But why wasn't the target one of the other wealthy orders that
Yeah.
resembled the Templars?
Actually, this is the key question. I mean, if there is one enigma, it is here. Why the temple? I mean, as I said, the context, you can't understand what happened without taking a deep, long look at the context. And the context was a war, a symbolic war between the papacy, which had universal jurisdiction over all ecclesiastical lands throughout Christianity, and the rising states. And first of all, the biggest states, the biggest state, the most powerful state in Christendom, that is the royal French state. And so a few years before the accusations against the Templar order, the French king and his counselors had launched accusations of heresy against the Pope himself. And you cannot separate the trial of the Templars and this first affair a few years before, in 1303. This was unheard of, these accusations against the Pope, as unheard as were unheard the accusations against a whole order. And actually, one can say that the trial of the Templars is stage 2 of after stage 1, which was accusations against the Pope himself, under a new Pope, Clement V. The Pope that was accused was Boniface VIII, and he had died shortly after. So why the Templar? Actually, the French counselors had to open another line of war, another battle. There still was this battle about the heresy of Boniface VIII, and whether the King of France, Philippe the Fair, had done well to accuse him or not, and to have him seized his very person in Anagni in 1303. A French counselor had come to Anagni next to Rome and had seized the Pope himself, but he couldn't make it to take him back to France to have him judged by a general council that would have been appealed, that would have been gathered by the King of France. He couldn't make it to take the Pope back to France, and then the Pope dies, and then a new Pope is elected, and you have negotiations to decide whether the suit will go on. What the French king asks is, I want you, new Pope, to acknowledge clearly that your predecessor was a heretic. You need to condemn him, and as a heretic, you need to have his bones taken off the ground and burnt publicly. You can imagine what this would have meant for the Apostolic See. This would have meant to acknowledge that Christendom had been saved against the Pope by the King of France. And at one stage, as the Pope resists, there is a new affair that starts. So why did they choose the Templars? It seems that the answer can be found studying the psychology and the reasoning, the thinking of one royal counselor, that is Guillaume de Nogaret, who was a mystical man, a very religious man, but his religion was that of a royal Christianity in a way. In his mind, and this is very clear in the speeches and the texts that he writes at that time, in his mind, a new time has come in the holy history of the chosen people of the sons of Christ, of the faithful. A new alliance is starting now, and you may remember that the temple was the place where the Ark of the Covenant was located in the history of the Hebrew people. And the order of the temple had been founded on the mount of the temple, and its very headquarters were what was thought at that time to be the palace of the Temple of Solomon. Guillaume de Nogaret reads Daniel, the prophecies. We know that he had in his office several treatises about the interpretation of the prophecies of Daniel. Among other things, Daniel says, the abomination of desolation will be settled in the temple when a new alliance will come, right? Between a new people and the Savior and God. So there is a whole, in a way, Guillaume de Nogaret with the Templar affair writes a fifth gospel, a new chapter in the history of the relationship between the faithful and Christ. And there is now a new savior on earth, a new vicar of Christ, and his name is the King of France. It's not, as he says, as his counselor says before the Pope, you are only now the spiritual vicar. There is a temporal vicar. And this temporal vicar, who was clearly chosen to be the minister of God in the Templars affair, in the Templar affair, is the King of France.
So let me bring this, connect this with modern events. Under different circumstances, a pope might have scorned Philip's pressure on him, or even excommunicated him. But sure. after the outrage at Agnani, to which you just referred, Pope Clement was in the Avignon exile of the papacy. He was in France, not in Rome, and he was in no position to excommunicate Philip. So he resisted at first, but ultimately, as we heard earlier, issued a papal bull suppressing the Templars. And I'm fascinated by what he wrote. He didn't state flat out that the Templars were guilty of something. Instead, he said, considering the infamy, suspicion, noisy insinuation which have arisen, it cannot be checked while this order remains in being. It's a striking non-condemnation. And
exactly.
It reminds me actually of there's a kind of a parallel between the Pope's rationalization and those who are now arguing that the 2020 presidential results in the United States were questionable. And so we need to tighten access to voting, to engage in voter suppression, not because there's hard evidence of any voter fraud, but because a lot of people believe the election was stolen. And that rationalization has been invoked by political leaders who themselves helped spread the conspiracy theory that the election was stolen and Joe Biden didn't really win. How do you react to the similarity of what the Pope said about the Templars and what's being said almost 8 centuries later about the need to investigate the 2020 election and change all the voting laws in the United States. Isn't that a striking parallel?
Well, the Pope's choice was a compromise. Obviously, he couldn't afford to go against the king, but he couldn't either afford to acknowledge the king's lies, because the Apostolic See would have lost in this case, and this was out of the question. But now, what you say about what happens now makes me very much think about what's called in the church the sensus fidelium. That is, you cannot, even if you're right, even if the truth is on your side, you cannot govern without consent, right? You cannot govern against what's thought, what's commonly thought. So that this was the pretext from the Pope in the Templar case. People think that it is so defamed that it can't live anymore. So I won't have to judge anything. There will be no verdict about the guilt, the actual guilt or not, because it is enough to see that it can't go on anymore anyway, whatever the truth is, and so we have to get rid of it. This general reasoning, I mean, it's connected to the fact, to the Christian idea that power comes from heaven, from God, but you cannot exert power against the people.
Kristen, you talked about the allure of conspiracy theories. It seems to me that there is a powerful parallel, as I suggested a few minutes ago, between what the Pope said and what's being said about whether or not Biden stole the election. Does that fit into this model of people want to believe these things because they're so disappointed by what's happened?
Absolutely. And in fact, you see that there are two professors who study conspiracy theories, Joe Parent and Joe Usinski, wrote a paper called Conspiracy Theories Are for Losers. And they looked at conspiracy narratives online and in the media over a period of many, many years. And they found a very consistent pattern that whenever a presidential election happens, the losing side always cries foul. If you think about it, there are always allegations of voter fraud happening on the part of the losing side. And that trend actually continues for the next 4 years. So the most popular conspiracy narratives are usually being uttered by the people whose party is not in the White House. So for example, when George W. Bush was president, 9/11 was an inside job. Dick Cheney and Halliburton were trying to earn money through war profiteering. These were the popular conspiracy theories of that time. And then President Obama took office and everyone was talking about how he faked his birth certificate. He was a Muslim, he wasn't born in America, etc. So there's a pretty clear pattern there. I will say, without going into too much detail, that the pattern has shifted a bit over the last 4 years. It was very unusual for somebody to do what Donald Trump did, which was to argue conspiracy theories and fraud, even though he won the election. And I think having a conspiracy theorist in the White House has certainly shifted that balance of which party is more inclined toward conspiracy thinking. But that is definitely the pattern over many, many years.
Michael, can you expand on the implications of all this and what happened to the Templars for modern times? I was struck last week by a poll that found that 29% of Republicans say they think there's something real to the charges that come from QAnon. How important is that? How dangerous?
We did a whole issue of Skeptic magazine that I publish on QAnon. It's one of the stranger conspiracy theories that I've ever encountered. You know, a satanic cult of pedophiles run by Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks and Lady Gaga and a few others out of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. I mean, this is about as crazy as it gets. So let's think about what it means to believe in a conspiracy theory, or really to believe in anything. And you say, I believe there's something to this. Now, of course, with polls, we're dependent upon self-report data. That is to say, when someone ticks a box, I believe that this could be true. 29% of Republicans, 13% of Democrats, by the way. So what are they signaling when they say, I believe this? This is not an objective form of truth, like empirical truth. They can't possibly believe that there's a satanic ring of pedophiles run by the Democrats. I mean, 29%, this is tens of millions of Republicans. They can't be that stupid. And people like Ted Cruz, he's not a dummy. He can't possibly believe this. So what they're doing, the conspiracy theory itself is kind of a mythic truth, a mythic belief, a kind of proxy for something else. Like, I'm so committed to my party, to my party boss, to our team, that I'm willing to publicly state I believe this ridiculous claim. And in a way that kind of shines a little bit of light on that, with Kristen's point on power. Most conspiracy theories do have a lot to do with power, and who has it, who doesn't, and who can hang on to it, and so on. And so these kinds of beliefs are proxies for something else. And if you look at since Kirsten mentioned 9/11, but in a way, 9/11 was a conspiracy. It was 19 members of Al Qaeda plotting to fly planes into buildings without telling us ahead of time. That's a conspiracy. And it took some time to kind of unravel how all that came about over the previous decades, really. Where did Osama bin Laden get all that money? Well, it's Saudi money in part. Well, how did the Saudis get this money? And we're in bed with the Saudis politically. What's going on there? There's much truth about that conspiracy that makes people suspect, something else is going on. And in 9/11 truth circles, they had this debate amongst themselves about, did Bush let it happen on purpose, lie hop, or did he make it happen on purpose, my hop? Well, my take on this is he capitalized on what happened on purpose, cow hop. That is to say, we know that there was never evidence for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And Bush himself later in his memoir said, this is the dumbest thing I ever did, acting on this. And because they never found him. Well, but really, this is what people in political power do. They capitalize on things that happen for other reasons, like Roosevelt and Pearl Harbor. There was conspiracy theories that Roosevelt either knew it was going to happen, let it happen on purpose, or made it happen on purpose. Neither. But he wanted to galvanize the American public against the American firsters. And so after it happened, then he capitalized on what happened to unite the country. So that's the real conspiracy, as it were. It's a type of conspiracy. And also, I also think about, or write about, sort of constructive paranoia or constructive conspiracism. Again, as I mentioned at the start, enough conspiracy theories are true. They're true conspiracies that it's reasonable for people to be suspicious. Like, for example, during the Kennedy administration, his chiefs of staff presented him a document of how to create a false flag operation in order to invade Cuba. This was post the Bay of Pigs disaster, and assassinate Castro. And these were like right out of a James Bond movie or some crazy conspiracy theory about, we're going to like shoot down an American plane with college kids going to, Mexico for a party on spring break, and we'll say the Cubans did it. Or we'll buzz Miami airport with a jet that looks like a MiG. And we'll poison Castro's cigars. And this one, it's on for pages and pages, Operation Northwood. You should read this thing. Now, to his credit, Kennedy said, we're not doing any of that. That's insane. But that his chiefs of staff, the head people in his administration, thought this was a good idea, tells us that, when someone like Alex Jones says, Sandy Hook was a false flag operation, or, 9/11 was a false flag operation, an inside job, that sounds crazy, but it's not completely crazy, because these things have gone on. We know from the Pentagon Papers how much deception was involved by Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson administrations, lying to the American public, lying to Congress about the Vietnam War. So when you read that, you go, okay, so I don't trust my government. I just don't, because look at all the things they've done. So then when you get something crazy like QAnon, And people go, yeah, I think there must be something crazy going on. Again, I don't think they really believe well, that one guy believed it. He went to the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria in Washington, D.C. with his gun. At least he had the conviction of his beliefs. Because if you really believe there was a criminal ring of pedophiles and no one was doing anything about it, you would want to take the law into your own hands. Okay. Now, these 29% of Republicans, they're not going to do anything like that. But again, they're signaling we don't trust big government or big anti-vaxxers. They don't trust big corporations. Well, big corporations do cheat. Think of Volkswagen cheating the emission standards in Europe. That's a conspiracy, right? We know, we see insider trading reported every day in the newspaper. There's enough of that goes on that, it's not completely crazy to think there's something to these even crazy conspiracy theories.
So I want to move on and talk about the media a little bit and how these theories get about. But Sean, did you have anything to say to any of this before I do?
No, I'm happy for us to move on there, Bob.
Okay. Look, in the 1300s, there was obviously none of the social media that today can drive a whole range of conspiracy theories. How did the charges against the Templars reach people in general? Did they? Was this known to, beyond sort of the elite circles around the King of France?
Yeah, I can speak to that. And the answer is very definitely yes. And although obviously it's long before social media or movies or TV, but some of the methods were quite modern. The first important step is to force leaders of the order to confess and to confess in public. So within 2 weeks of their arrests, the Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, was trotted out in public in Paris. A large crowd is gathered purposely to hear him speak, and he confesses that the charges are true, almost certainly after having been tortured. And the second means is by gathering some of the first examples of what in France are known as the Estates General. It's the same period that the Parliament is taking shape in England, and in France the parallel is the Estates General, and it's Philip IV, first in his conflicts with Boniface VIII, but then around the Templars, who takes these first steps to gather representatives from the towns, not really for what we think of as democratic purposes, but really to hear what the king wants from them. And so people are told they must come from around France to hear what the king has to say in order to gather public opinion behind the king. It's obviously pre-modern methods, but it's a very modern sense of controlling the message and using the means available to get what we would call public relations out there.
So we have a fragmentation now of media sources. We have vast social media networks. People can go wherever they want to get whatever information they want. Does that make it easier to propagate conspiracies, or is the lesson from the Templars that it's always been easier than we might assume to spread what Pope Clement called noisy insinuation? I'm thinking, for example, in the last century about McCarthyism and the wave of accusations that the Democrats lost China to the communists, or the conspiracy theories about the assassination of President Kennedy. I mean, this is all pre-social media, although we had television and radio, obviously. We had mass media. So is it really all that different now than it was 800 years ago?
Probably just the speed at which it spreads. I mean, if you look at the history of the JFK conspiracy theorists, they started off as just like a couple people in a basement with a mimeograph machine, and then they print these little ersatz newsletters and spread them by word of mouth. But the example you just gave in the 13th century, word of mouth can spread pretty fast in a community. Maybe a few days to a few weeks, as opposed to seconds or minutes online. So it's just a matter of speed. But really, a few weeks is nothing still, and you can get that just by word of mouth.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Well, I would just add that there are different incentives in the social media space, right? Now you can make money by spreading conspiracy theories online. You can gather eyeballs and get lots of attention. And in many ways, social media is a platform that favors these types of narratives. If it is sensational, people are more likely to click on it and share it. If it taps into certain emotions, particularly high arousal emotions like fear, anger, disgust, those are the kinds of things that have been shown to make people more likely to click on a headline and to share it. So in that sense, social media really is a good vehicle for spreading conspiracy theories. And we've also seen that there's been lots of discussion about fact checking and improving journalism and people's information diets, which is of course very important, but it's also the case that when fact corrections are published, they are not nearly as widely viewed, right? So you put a sensational claim out there, lots of people click on it and read it and share it. And then somebody tries to come along and correct that a day or two later. That correction is seen by a tiny fraction of the people who saw the original claim. And the more that claim is repeated, the more it solidifies in people's brains, whether it's true or not. So of course, this sort of gets back to the example you gave about election fraud, right? It was repeated over and over and over again. And lots of people have said that's totally unsubstantiated. It didn't happen, but it's still solidified in, the national subconscious. So it's very hard to change people's minds once those things are out there. And I think that was true before social media came along, but it works a little bit differently now.
Yeah, I also jump in here on the social media front that there's this movement afoot that social media is like an existential threat because of pushing us toward a post-truth, fake news, alternative facts world. The evidence for this now is pretty weak. It looks like most of the social media postings of fake news stories only reinforce what people already believe. The people that didn't believe it are on the other team say it didn't change their minds. It looks like only a couple percentage of people actually absorbed the fake news stories that the Russian bots were posting at, before 2016 and again before 2020 election. So my favorite example of this is if I point out to a far right Trump supporter that QAnon is fake, there is no basement at the Comet Ping Pong pizzeria, which the shooter discovered when he got there and went, oh, there's no basement. Now, it's not like these people are going to go, oh, so QAnon is fake. Okay, so Hillary's not doing these things. I think I'll vote for Hillary. No, they were never going to vote for Hillary anyway. This is just reinforcing what they already believe. And here I'd point to Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday. So there's a debate in cognitive psychology about to what extent we're naturally gullible or naturally skeptical. Well, I like to think we're naturally skeptical since I publish a magazine called Skeptic. But, I've long thought, well, humans are pretty gullible. But Hugo points out that most cult leaders, for example, fail, that most religions fail to get adherents. Most self-help groups don't turn into cults, and most political advertising is a complete waste of money. In terms of converting voters, it just reinforces the team platform and why you got to get out the vote and so on. They're not really changing minds. They're just trying to kind of reinforce the team spirit and get people out to vote. And I think there's pretty good evidence of that now, that most people are not that gullible. And so there's this Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma. It's just 2 hours of these programmers, self-flagellating for creating the like button on Facebook, like they're J. Robert Oppenheimer with blood on their hands for nuclear weapons. Oh, it's just pathetic. It's like, dude, you're not J. Robert Oppenheimer, and social media is not nuclear weapons, and it is not an existential threat. And, since 2016, there's been a rise in all these fact-checking sites. There's a market for it. These people are making money, and they fact-check politicians' speeches in real time, and people want to know that. And that's the counter to it, not break up the social media companies and dissolve them or criminally accuse them of causing, these terrible things. It's just not true.
As someone who used to make political spots, I won't debate with you the impact of political advertising. Instead,
what do you think?
I think that there are instances where spots have had enormous power. I think of 1988, the Willie Horton ad, Bush behind, and the impact that had, along with all the other accusations against Dukakis that were put out in spots. So I think there are times when spots have big impacts, and also in very close races where if you move just a few votes, spots can be very important, and they're very important in primaries where voters are open to voting for any of a number of candidates because they ideologically generally agree with them. But what I'd like to do is turn this over to our audience and some of the questions that they've asked, and any or all of you can respond. This question is from Susan Rosser. Many of the groups and individuals supporting Donald Trump come out of their belief that Christ directly tapped him as his representative on earth. Thus, whatever Trump posits as truth or any of the conspiracies he supports become part of their belief system as well. The main loud voices promoting this come not only from people around Trump, but from entities like Fox News. Isn't this exactly like a religious conspiracy in the 14th century? Anyone want to take that?
Yes, well, most candidates say that God's on their side, along with football teams and armies.
But literally, we have seen people say he is God's anointed, and he's going to actually be installed as president on March 4th. And when that didn't happen, they moved the date to June because God has foreordained him to save the United States.
Yes.
Yeah, this rings a bell. This does ring a bell for the medievalists. You have those theories mainly from the 13th century on. Some people saying, well, the end of the world will happen in 1262, 1266, and especially in Italy, we know of a huge popular movements related to these dates that were given by prophets. And then when the date came and nothing happened, then the date was postponed, right? This is nothing new, actually.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the person that explained that initially was Leon Festinger, the psychologist who in 1954 joined a group of end timers at the top of a hill outside of Chicago to wait for the mothership to show up. It was kind of a UFO cult, but it was a religious cult. And they believed that massive floods were going to wipe out the Midwest of the United States, and they were going to escape in this UFO. Anyway, he was curious to see what would happen when nothing happened. So he wrote a famous book about this called When Prophecy Fails. And this is where he coined the term cognitive dissonance. That is to say, when there's a conflict between the facts you hold as true and then the counter evidence to it. So when the mothership didn't come, they wrung their hands and bewailed and gnashed their teeth and so forth. But they went home and doubled down on the recruitment as a way of, with the usual rationalizations. Well, we miscalculated, or it was a test of our faith, and we were rewarded for our loyalty, so the earth wasn't destroyed, and so forth. And that typically happens. I was following some Reddit pages of people that were disappointed after January 20th because they thought, well, that'll do it. Well, first January 6th, then January 20th, and now, March 4th, and now it's going to be June, I guess. We'll see what happens. They keep pushing the date back. But some people have been disappointed. Like, I just cannot believe it. I thought for sure it would happen. So what will they do? That'll be curious to see in the coming year or two, if they abandon it or if they keep it going. And, anyway, so there's a psychological factor there that's involved. And the curious thing for me was, I've been following the religious right since the moral majority came online in the 80s. And, to their credit, at least they seemed to pick people that were actually religious. They were Christians, not just in name, but they seemed to actually believe it, particularly, say, George W. Bush. But how could they back Trump, who's got to be the least Christian person in the history of Christianity who claimed to be Christian, right? And so I've asked a lot of conservative public intellectuals and just regular people, and it seems to be that, well, he's our guy. Whoever it is, he's our leader. This is my team, and I'm voting my team no matter what. I don't care how many women he grabs and bankruptcies he has or whatever. God works in mysterious ways. Who can say, why he appointed this particular flawed character? Like many of the characters in the Bible are pretty flawed, I've been told, by these Christian conservatives, saying, see, Trump's no worse than some of these crazy biblical characters. And look what they did for religion. Oh, okay.
Okay. This next question takes us back 800 years again, and maybe Julian or Sean, you want to address it. It comes from Susanna Baxendale. Could I ask a follow-up about the statement yesterday that it was Nogaret who wanted to be unexcommunicated, and it was his fear of dying excommunicate, which was behind the accusations against the Templars?
This was one of the causes, yes. Sean, maybe you wanna add more?
Julian, that's your territory, plain and simple.
Well, yes, as always, there are several factors that come together in any situation. And yes, one of Nogare's motives was personal. He was involved in the Anani affair, that moment when in an incredible way for the time, the unbelievable happened. That is, the Vicar of Christ was seized, and it was said that he was also molested. You must imagine that for a century, the Vicar of Christ had a tremendous prestige throughout Christianity. So the idea that his person could be, captured and yes, he could be made a prisoner. Dante wrote a little later that what had happened to this Pope, whom he didn't like at all, by the way, but what had happened to him renewed the passion of Christ, and that Nogare, seizing him and hurting him, had done what was done to Christ. This what Nogare had done as a mystical man, he had to justify it, and first he had to justify it for himself, right? He had to convince himself that he'd been right. Otherwise, I mean, his life after death, of course, was threatened, and that it was either black or white in his mind. After doing this, you have nothing. You have no choice. You have to move on, and you can't stop, right? And we have a very, very interesting letter from text from Nogare. He's writing down what he's about to tell the king about what is to be done now after Boniface VIII's death, because the king, with this new pope, thinks that maybe he should compromise. He should give it up. I mean, he should give up the Boniface cause and stop asking for the Pope's heresy to be acknowledged by the Apostolic See. Now, Peggy Brown, the great American historian, has rediscovered this text, and she has re-edited it. And we see Nogare saying, doing a sermon to the king and say, you must not stop now what you've started. Christ didn't stop when he started. You must not stop. And so, of course, one of Nogare's motives is that he is the only one in the royal entourage who's still excommunicated. The Pope, again, has done a compromise. He has absolved the king, who was about to be excommunicated by Boniface VIII before Boniface died. He has absolved some people, but not Nogare. He doesn't want to give it up with Nogare. And so Nogare is very, very motivated, and he finds, yes, he makes it. He succeeds in convincing the Pope to work for him personally and to go on with this general project and enterprise.
We only have a couple of minutes, and there's a question here that I think is not going to be easy to answer in short order, but we'll try. It's anonymous. If there are true conspiracies, why write off so-called conspiracy theories completely and malign those that believe them? Rather than a binary analysis, wouldn't looking at conspiracy theories on a spectrum seem a better option? For example, one of the presenters compared 9/11 theories and Halliburton war profiting to the birther theory. But why? The United States did arm the precursors to Al-Qaeda, including Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, and Halliburton did profit from the post 9/11 wars. There was no proof for the birther theory. The former seems far more plausible than the latter, and it seems disingenuous to lump them together. So, Michael, you lump them together.
Yeah, I agree. No, I'm a spectrum kind of guy. I'm on the spectrum. No, continuous thinking is always better than binary thinking for almost everything in life because things are more complicated. So you have to take each conspiracy theory one by one. I mean, Lincoln was assassinated by a conspiracy, a cabal. I don't think JFK was. I think it was a lone assassin. All the evidence points to Lee Harvey Oswald. No evidence points to any other particular candidate, and there are dozens listed, all the way up to Vice President Johnson. So, yeah, you have to take them one at a time. And, there was no evidence for Bush knowing about 9/11, but we have lots of evidence that, he capitalized on it. He used it, which all presidents do. Things that just happen to happen, they use them for, political reasons. That's kind of normal politicking. So yeah, one at a time, just what is the evidence? The strange thing about the rigged election, again, everything was weird about the last 4 years. Everything was kind of upside down in conspiracy theorizing about conspiracy theories, is that usually when leaders of your team say, no, this one's not real. There are rigged elections, yes, but not this one. So when it got all the way up to AG Barr saying, no fraud, usually the people underneath go, oh, okay, all right, we'll drop this one and move on to something else. But they didn't. That was what was so weird. But again, that's, everything is kind of upside down the last few years.
We have to conclude, I think, because we're running out of time. The other question that I wanted to ask is, a lot of conspiracy theories like anti-vaxxers are literally dangerous.
Yeah.
Is there any way to control this, to turn back the tide of conspiracy theories? If any of you have a thought on that, I'd love to hear it.
I would say it's difficult because it is really hardwired into our brains and has been for a very long time. A lot of it does come down to trust. So one of the episodes of the Pulling the Thread series has to do with prudent paranoia, this idea that Michael Shermer spoke about, that conspiracies do exist. And there's a lot of suspicion about healthcare, particularly amongst African Americans, people of color who have historically been mistreated thanks to medical conspiracies like the Tuskegee experiment. And there are efforts underway that show some promise that it's really about rebuilding trust in that institution first and foremost. It's really on doctors and healthcare as a broader institution to earn that trust, to make sure that doctors look like and know how to speak to the people that they treat in their communities. So, we need some of that rebuilding in healthcare. We need that in science. And of course, we absolutely need it in politics. The other thing you can do is try to think about where the root fear is coming from and how to address that fear. If it's economic insecurity, what can you do about that? If it's social insecurity around things like immigration, how can you sort of address the root problem that people are writing a narrative to sort of walk their way back out of it and feel better about it? What is the root problem and how can you address that more directly?
I'm going to get spanked if I don't bring this to an end. I do think, in terms of what you just said, that there are conspiracy theories that are very hard to counter, because what I think drove the JFK conspiracy theory, assassination theory, was this deep sense of profound loss and the utter incredulity that some guy ordered a rifle through a mail order for $22.95 and managed to shoot the president of the United States, which at that time seemed unthinkable. So I want to say thanks to our audience, and a special thanks to Sean, to Kristen, to Julien, who I assume is already home so that he's in compliance with the French curfew, and to Michael. Thanks, everybody. And now on to our next panel, Apocalypse Then and Now, from millenarian cults to QAnon. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.